"You old fool. Sit down. You are spoiling the evening." Elliot Mercer, aged 84, climbed the dais with careful steps, and the hall stilled. He wore a coat with ribbons that had faded to memory, and each ribbon carried a weight the program did not know. An aide approached with that polite firmness officers use when they remove inconvenience. He said, "You are not on the list, sir," and kept his hand near the microphone. Elliot let the words fall like small stones and watched how they made ripples. The banquet room was brass and habit and neat ranks of faces. Conversation thinned into listening, which is its own kind of attention. A table of junior officers exchanged glances, as if paging through a story they had not bought. Elliot said his name and age plainly, as if announcing whether, neither of which was permitted in speech. "My name is Elliot Mercer," he said, and he gave his age with a calm steadier than some men in new uniforms. The sound of the name found a few ears that tightened. He had the hands of a man who had repaired more than machinery. The left thumb bore a pale scar where a strap had burned, a small map that told of work and proximity to danger. Those hands rested on his knees and did not ask for pity. Someone at the back muttered, "Who is he?" And the question spread like a draft under a door. An officer rifled a folder and found nothing. Protocol suffocated the room for a moment, and memory began to tug at the corners. Elliot lifted a cap from his lap. The inner band stamped Hill 734 in ink that had almost given up. The letters were small, patient, and impossible to ignore when shown. A nurse at a nearby table made a sound that was neither laugh nor gasp, and the hall leaned forward. He started to tell, in a voice that had given up on ornament. He spoke of a ridge held long enough to keep others from falling back, of a radio that clung to static, and of men named aloud so their absence would remain named. His sentences were spare, exact, like ledger entries about human things. A detail landed, precise and jagged, and it rearranged faces. He named a corporal who had been listed as missing, and a man rose from the back before anyone told him to. The man who stood was small in build, older than his photograph suggested, and he carried a piece of the past like a debt. Elliot unfolded a photograph, edges soft with years, and the image pulled breath from the room. In the picture, a cluster of young faces stared toward the camera, as if daring the world to keep punishing them. The center showed a grin that belonged to a boy called Michael, and that grin turned minds to a ledger someone had misfiled. For years, Elliot had moved through docks and yards, an unseen presence who mended nets and listened to the sea. He had written letters to a Navy office and watched them vanish into a bureaucracy that assumed absence meant closure. People assumed that rolls and registers were reliable, until one man stood and proved the contrary. A junior officer quoted regulation aloud, the sort of thing that sounds like reason if repeated enough. Elliot met the officer with a look that did not need words. The look said, "This is not a point of law." More names surfaced, each one like a small bell. A colonel checked his tablet, and an archivist near the back recognized a hand scroll in a ledger left unsigned. The room traded quiet discoveries like soldiers trading smokes in a dim room, and each scrap arranged an outline of guilt and forgetting. Elliot did not ask for medals. He spoke of simple acts, of sharing a tin that had more hope than food, of tying a bootlace for a man who would not stand again. These acts sounded ordinary, and that ordinariness made them harder to dismiss. A voice in the gallery began to sing, softly at first, a tune like a hospital corridor. An admiral who had kept his jaw rigid for decades found his chin loosen. The sound of a handkerchief being unfolded carried as much message as any citation. Why had men like Elliot been left out of lists? The question murmured in fork and glass. The reasons were not neat. They were human, and messy with paperwork and assumptions, and names written differently across borders. Elliot sat and let the hall catch him. When the salute came, it was not the crisp motion of a parade. It was slow, as if the room had learned how to be exact in another language. At the end of the section, the hall held its breath because the story had not finished. There was a remainder, a thread unresolved, and the pause asked for more. One name remained, tucked into silence. The photograph trembled slightly in Elliot's hand, not from weakness, but from memory trying to rise. Someone at the back breathed the name, Hill 734, and the room changed. An older lieutenant's jaw tightened, as if an old wound had been touched. Hill 734 was not a tale for dinners. It was a ridge men mentioned only when drink removed caution. Elliot's mind slid back. Tables became rocks, the hall narrow as a line of figures, trying only to hold a place. He was 22 again, a corporal with more men than choices, and the world reduced to a radio and a promise. Their orders were blunt. Hold the ridge until relief arrived. Relief did not come. The radio died, and the map ceased to match the earth. He kept faces to keep them human. Tom with a crooked grin, who traded his last rations. Lewis, who marked days on his rifle until the marks stopped. And Callum, who folded letters into his sleeve and kept them like contraband. They dug shallow hollows and pretended the earth would keep them. Each night roll call answered with fewer voices. They learned to share silence the way civilians share small talk. When the order to fall back crackled through static, Elliot's section was cut off. The slope had altered, the path back erased. He told his men to dig in, not because it saved them, but because doing something kept despair at bay. He wired a broken receiver into a crude beacon, feeding current through an ammunition tin. The signal was a faint heartbeat in white noise. No reply came, yet sending mattered more than answer. He stayed with a private whose leg was crushed beneath stone, speaking nonsense to keep the man breathing. When the man went still, Elliot folded his tags and promised he would tell their names. Names mattered more than medals. He wrote them on scraps in a small notebook that kept meaning, where bureaucracy failed. He buried 3 men in shallow rock and kept dog tags as if they were letters from home. Why does courage persist when no one watches? The question pulsed under his telling. The answer lived in hands that tied bootlaces and in small repairs that kept radios alive a moment longer. Elliot was found by a search unit days later, gaunt and clinging to the hill. They called him lucky. He thought luck the wrong word. He had carried others across absence and returned with their names. At hospital his notebook was taken and misplaced. Somewhere between field and ledger, his presence became an entry marked missing. Listeners shifted as if to accommodate a new weight. Memory obeys a different chain of command, and it ordered attention now. Admiral Patrick Reeves sat very still. His father had been at Hill 734. The Admiral's eyes found the photograph Elliot held, and in that face he recognized a grin his mother had mentioned. The grin belonged to Michael, the boy in the center. Understanding reached the Admiral quietly. He rose and walked the aisle, his steps erasing decades of protocol. He stopped before Elliot and gave a command that required no fanfare. "Officers, stand to attention." Chairs scraped and 100 people rose as one. The motion was sober, not theatrical. There was no band, only the collective breath of acknowledgement. Elliot stayed seated, hands folded over the cap stamped Hill 734. He had expected indifference. He had not expected this depth of respect. The salute held longer than regulation. In that suspended time, the gap between generations narrowed. The Admiral's voice came low. "You saved my father." Elliot looked up. His reply was calm and spare. "I kept my promise." He tried to stand, a habit from years of service, but the Admiral placed a hand on his shoulder and stopped him. "You have stood enough," the Admiral said. Applause began, polite at first, then steadied into something truer. Elliot allowed a small nod. He did not want medals. He wanted names remembered, the projection behind them, filled with the photograph, enlarged so every face looked back. Below it, simple words appeared, for each other. The hall held silence, as if a small sacred thing had been set on the table. Elliot traced the photo, and a line crossed his face that only he could read. He turned as if to speak, but paused. A part of the story remained folded, a thread not yet pulled. He set his cap on the table and tapped its brim twice, a gesture that closed a sentence without speaking it. He waited, eyes open. The Admiral met his gaze. "We will remember," he said. Elliot's answer was softer than an oath. "Then remember them all." The applause rose again, deeper now, but the air retained an unfinished note. Someone had known Elliot before tonight. Someone had kept his name alive. The crowd felt that presence like a door left ajar. Ceremony had opened a space ceremony could not fill. Silence settled like a hand waiting for a signal, and the audience felt the pause keenly. The applause faded, not because it lost strength, but because silence spoke louder. Elliot remained still, the brim of his cap catching the light. Behind him, the projection lingered on the faces of Hill 734, refusing to disappear. A young officer approached with a folder, hesitant, as if stepping into history uninvited. Admiral Reeves took it, eyes unreadable. He opened the folder and drew a single page, thin, yellowed, official. He glanced at Elliot, then at the audience. "This was filed 1 year ago," he said quietly. "It's the list of names for the memorial at Portsmouth. There, beneath those who never came home, is one name written in my own hand. Elliot Mercer, presumed dead, but never forgotten." A ripple went through the hall. Someone whispered. He knew. The Admiral's voice carried again. "Steady now. I entered his name because I believed the reports were wrong. My father told me once, before he passed, that a man named Mercer saved his life. He said, 'If you ever hear that name again, stand up.'" Elliot's eyes did not shine. They deepened. He said softly, "Then your father kept his word." The Admiral gave a faint nod. The kind soldiers give when words have done enough. Elliot rose slowly, joints stiff but intent unwavering. He looked around at the faces, some proud, some guilty, all listening. He said, "It was never about the hill. It was about the men who climbed it together, the ones who stayed, the ones who carried each other down." He paused, voice even. "We didn't fight for flags. We fought so someone else could go home." The line hung there, simple and devastating. A few officers lowered their heads, and one young cadet wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve, pretending it was dust. Elliot took the folder gently from the Admiral's hand. His fingers brushed the page with his own name, written as a ghost. He folded it once, then again, and tucked it into his jacket pocket. He turned to the Admiral. "Keep it that way," he said. "Dead or alive, let it remind them what that word means." The Admiral met his gaze. "It will stay," he replied. Elliot nodded. "Then that's enough." He stepped down from the stage, walking through the rows of uniforms now forming a quiet corridor. Each figure straightened as he passed, offering a salute that broke regulation, but honored truth. The air felt heavier, as if filled with all the words they would never say. At the door, Elliot paused. He glanced once more at the projection, the faces, the ridge, the light frozen on their youth. He raised his hand in a final salute. It was not for himself. Outside, the night was still. The street beyond the hall glimmered with reflections from the harbor. Ships lay anchored, their lights distant but steady. He could hear faint sounds of laughter from inside, fading now into murmurs. He reached the railing overlooking the water and rested his hands there, the folder pressing against his chest. For a moment, he closed his eyes. The harbor smelled of metal, salt, and memory. He took the folded paper from his pocket, looked at it, and smiled, not of pride, but relief. It no longer mattered whether he existed on a list. The story had survived, and that was enough. Behind him, a soft voice called. Admiral Reeves stood at the door, cap under his arm. He hesitated, then stepped forward. "Sir, may I ask, why did you come tonight?" Elliot turned slightly, the answer already waiting. "Because someone finally sent the invitation." The Admiral frowned, uncertain. Elliot continued. "A letter came last month. No name, just a sentence. 'Come to the gala, old man. It's time.' Signed only with an initial. M." He smiled faintly. "I think your father had a hand in it." Reeves blinked. a small shock flickering through composure. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The idea sounded impossible, and yet felt true. Elliot looked back toward the sea. You see, Admiral, some debts find their own messengers, and some promises don't end when the war does. The Admiral stood beside him, both men silent for a long while. The waves below carried faint echoes, as if the sea itself remembered the ridge's name. When Reeves finally spoke, his voice was low. Hill 734. I read about it once. They said it was lost. Elliot shook his head. No hill ever dies. It just waits for someone to remember it. He turned, extending his hand. The Admiral took it without hesitation. The gesture was simple, but in that moment, it felt like the closing of an unfinished chapter. Elliot adjusted his cap. Time to go, the Admiral asked. Where will you go? Elliot smiled. Home, I think. Wherever that is now. He walked away, steps unhurried, the sound of his cane steady against the stone floor. The Admiral watched until he vanished into the shadow between the lamps. Then, without thinking, Reeves straightened his posture and saluted. From the open doors behind him, the officers inside the hall saw the gesture and, one by one, followed. A line of salutes stretching through the doorway. Toward the night, Elliot did not turn around, but perhaps he felt it, the weight of 100 hands raised, the quiet echo of honor restored. The harbor lights blinked once, reflected on the water like fading signals. In that stillness, the salute continued, long after he was gone, and when morning came, a single cap lay on the pier, stamped faintly with the words that once defined a ridge and now defined a man. Hill 734, never forgotten. Some stories remind us that honor isn't in medals, but in the people who never stopped caring. If this one stirred something in you, take a moment to call someone you haven't spoken to in years, or share it with the person who once stood by you when no one else did. Because remembrance only lives when we pass it on.